The coldest wall in your house is quietly costing you $600 every single winter. That is the north side or the west side, whichever one takes the worst of the cold. It pulls heat out of your living room faster than your furnace can put it back, and your thermostat never stops fighting back. You are paying to heat a house that is actively working against you. What I am going to show you in this video is a technique that cuts any heating bill in America by 43%. $500 in materials and 1 weekend of your time is the entire cost. And the method is older than the United States Constitution. The Icelandic farmers have been building it on that island since the year 874. They have lived in houses for more than 1,000 years where the inner walls stay warm to the touch even at 15 below zero, with no furnace and no heating fuel burning anywhere inside. The University of Minnesota proved the numbers with hard data in 1978. And from 1982 through the end of that decade, federal mortgage appraisers quietly refused to finance a single home in America built on this exact principle. The houses were not failing inspection. They worked too well, and the lending industry could not figure out how to keep you paying for heat forever. Stay with me on this one even if you have lived in the same house for 40 years, and even if you have never picked up a shovel for anything more than a flower bed. What I am about to show you works on a 1970s Rambler in Iowa, the same way it works on a brick colonial in Pennsylvania. You do not have to tear your house down, hire an architect, or fight your county building department over a permit. Let me start with a number that should make you angry before I get to the part that will make you understand. The average American household spent roughly $1,400 on home heating last winter according to Department of Energy figures. In New England, that number runs closer to $2,000 a year. In the upper Midwest, natural gas bills have been climbing steadily for 4 straight years with no sign of slowing down. If you have owned your home for 20 years, you have already handed roughly $30,000 to a utility company for the privilege of being cold anyway. But the wall on the cold side of your house, the one facing the wind, is where most of that money actually goes. Building scientists at Oak Ridge National Laboratory have been measuring residential envelope heat loss for decades. Their data consistently shows that in a typical American home built between 1960 and 1990, the single coldest exterior wall can account for up to 40% of total heating loss. That is nearly 40 cents of every dollar you burn on heating going out through one wall. That same wall is the one the Icelanders solved 1,000 years ago. The trip to Iceland was not something I had originally planned. It started in a diner in southern Indiana last January. I was sitting across from a retired contractor named Dale, a man I have known for close to 20 years, who spent 2 summers in the 1970s working on a sod roof cabin up in northern Wisconsin. Dale is not a man who wastes his words. He was stirring his coffee, looking out the window at a gas station across the road where the sign read $3.91 a gallon, and he said something I have not been able to stop thinking about since. He said the Europeans up north figured out winter 1,000 years ago, and we forgot on purpose. I asked him what he meant by that. He told me about a Norwegian engineer he had worked with back in the 80s, a man who had grown up in a house with walls of packed turf. That engineer had told Dale his family had never paid for heating oil, not once in 5 generations. I drove home that night turning that sentence over in my head. For the next 2 weeks, I pulled every record I could find. University of Minnesota reports from the late 70s, Malcolm Wells and his drawings from New Jersey, Department of Energy archives, photographs from the Icelandic National Museum in Reykjavik. By mid-October, I was driving a rented Land Rover 4 hours north of Reykjavik, Iceland, on a gravel road with black volcanic rock on one side and the cold North Atlantic Ocean on the other. The farm I was looking for sits in a valley outside Skagafjörður at a turf house site called Glaumbær. The structures there have been continuously maintained since the 18th century, and the oldest foundations underneath them go back to the original Norse settlement of the island. The caretaker met me at the gate. His name was Stefan, late 60s, gray beard, wool sweater, and he gestured for me to follow him toward the main turf wall without saying much of anything. The door was so low I had to duck to get through it. Inside the farmhouse, the light came through 2 small glass panes set deep into walls thicker than my arm was long. The smell was old wood and cold stone and the faintest trace of wool. I pulled out a digital thermometer I had brought with me from the States. Outside, the air was reading 18 degrees Fahrenheit with a hard north wind cutting off the water. Inside that main room, with no fire lit and no heat source of any kind in the building, the thermometer on my palm read 51 degrees. Stefan watched me stare at the number. He put his hand flat against the interior surface of the wall, and then he said the sentence I wrote down in my notebook and underlined twice. He said, "We did not fight the winter, we built inside it." He pulled his hand away and pointed at the wall section. 2 meters of packed earth, layered between a wooden inner frame and an outer sod exterior, cut in herringbone pattern so the seams between blocks lock against wind and rain. The Icelanders have a name for this kind of house. They call it a torfbær, which simply means turf farm. In the year 874, when the first Norse settlers landed on that island and realized there were almost no trees large enough to build a conventional timber house, they looked at the ground beneath their feet and built with what they had. Every structure on Iceland between the 9th century and the 1930s was built on the same principle. Those houses survived the Little Ice Age while stone and wood homes on the European mainland were freezing families to death in their beds. Stefan told me his grandmother had been born in a turf house in 1926 and had never once experienced a winter morning where frost formed on the inside of her bedroom wall. What kept me up at night after I got home and started cross-referencing the archaeology was something I had not expected at all. The Icelanders did not invent this principle on their own. They perfected a survival technique that shows up in the archaeological record of nearly every cold climate culture on the planet, which means there is something much bigger going on here than one weird island in the North Atlantic. The Mandan people along the Missouri River built earth lodges continuously for more than 4 centuries before Lewis and Clark walked into their settlements in 1804. Those lodges were bermed into hillsides and covered with 2 feet of packed sod. Explorer journals from that winter recorded that the interior of a Mandan lodge stayed just above freezing when the air outside dropped to -40 degrees, with only a small central fire burning inside. Mongolian herders on the steppes built winter shelters into south-facing hillsides, walls dug 3 feet into the earth and capped with a turf and timber roof. Ukrainian farmers in the Carpathian foothills built a traditional structure called a mazanka, a timber frame packed with straw and clay and bermed on the north wall against whatever hill they could find. The Turkmen of Central Asia, the Sami of Lapland, the Irish along the western coast of Donegal, every cold climate culture that faced a real winter arrived at the same conclusion independently. The earth stores what the fire cannot. The ground itself is the cheapest and most reliable insulation that has ever existed on this planet. The only reason you have never been told about any of it is that none of these methods can ever be patented. There is no subscription model, no monthly bill, and no quarterly earnings report for dirt. Here is why the physics of a bermed wall changes the math on heating your house so completely. And you need to understand both mechanisms before I show you who buried this. The first mechanism is ground temperature. At 6 feet of depth, the soil under your home holds between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit all year round, regardless of what is happening in the air above it. Oak Ridge National Laboratory documented this city by city across the continental United States. The ground in Minneapolis sits at 52 degrees all year, the same soil in Kansas City reads 57, and in Boston it holds steady at 54. Even on the coldest January night when the air outside is bottoming out at 10 below zero, the earth 6 feet down is still sitting at 50. Any wall pressed against that earth is now pressed against a 50-degree thermal reservoir instead of a -10-degree wind hammering the siding. The second mechanism is thermal mass, and this is where most Americans get it completely wrong. A wall of packed earth does not insulate the way fiberglass insulation does. It does something much better than insulation. Fiberglass blocks heat transfer by trapping still air between millions of glass fibers, which works, but only in one direction at a time. A thick earth wall absorbs heat slowly during the day, stores it inside the mass of the wall itself, and releases it slowly through the night. It flattens the temperature swings that would otherwise spike your furnace on and off all night long. Your thermostat stops kicking on every 30 minutes because the wall itself is acting like a slow battery that recharges from the sun and discharges into your living room. Engineers call this the thermal flywheel effect, and it was almost completely removed from American residential construction curricula between 1950 and 1975. Somebody decided the flywheel was bad for business. The man who almost single-handedly tried to bring this principle back to American construction was an architect from Cherry Hill, New Jersey named Malcolm Wells. Wells had spent the first 15 years of his career designing conventional suburban office buildings, the kind of flat-roofed brick and glass structures that went up in strip mall developments across the country between 1955 and 1965. In his own autobiography, Wells described the exact moment he quit that line of work. He was standing on a hillside in southern New Jersey in the summer of 1964, watching a bulldozer pave over a meadow to build a parking lot for a building he had designed himself. He said he looked down at his own shoes and realized he had spent his whole career helping to kill the living earth. He went home that night, pulled out a sketchbook, and drew the first architectural plan for what he would later call gentle architecture. A house bermed with soil on 3 sides, a green roof covered in grass, and windows facing south to catch the winter sun. In 1975, Wells built a building called Solaria in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. An office bermed on 3 sides with New Jersey soil, roof planted with native grasses, south wall glazed to harvest passive solar heat all winter. In its first full year of operation, Solaria consumed 1/5 of the heating fuel of a comparable conventional office building on the same block. That is a full 80% reduction in heating cost against the building sitting next door. Wells wrote more than 30 books over the next 3 decades trying to convince the American construction industry to take this method seriously as mainstream practice. The industry listened to none of it. Every Solaria that got built meant 1 less furnace sold, 1 less HVAC service contract signed, and 1 less mortgage that needed refinancing every 8 years. But Malcolm Wells was still just one architect with a sketchbook, and the industry could write him off as a lone crusader. What came out of Minneapolis 3 years later was a different problem entirely. In 1978, the University of Minnesota opened what they called the Underground Space Center, a research division funded initially by a Department of Energy grant intended to study alternative residential construction during the oil crisis. They ran a multi-year field study in Lexington, Kentucky, tracking the heating and cooling performance of 32 earth-bermed homes across a range of designs. The results came back in 1981, and the numbers were so clean the researchers had to double-check their own raw data. Homes bermed against the prevailing wind direction required 43% fewer heating degree days than conventionally constructed homes of the same square footage in the same neighborhood. The cooling load in summer was eliminated entirely. 43% off heating and 100% off cooling published in the center's annual report, and circulated across the academic and government research community that year. Then the document essentially disappeared from public circulation. The 43% number is still quoted in graduate architecture programs today if you know where to look for it, but it has never been quoted in a single advertisement for residential heating equipment in this country. Now here is where the story turns from quiet neglect to documented suppression, and this is the part I want you to understand because it is the answer to the question I know you are asking right now, which is why have I never heard of any of this before? In the spring of 1982, a retired high school teacher and his wife in the Missouri Ozarks, a couple in their early 60s, finished building an earth-sheltered home they had worked on together for 2 full summers. They had poured the concrete footings themselves, bermed the north and west walls with nearly 4 feet of local clay soil, and installed south-facing windows along with a green roof covered in native prairie grass. A small cast-iron wood stove in the main room provided backup heat on the coldest nights of the year. The house was roughly 1,400 square feet. Their total construction cost was just under $19,000, at a time when a comparable conventional house in the same county was selling for $52,000. They applied to refinance the construction loan through a small local bank that routed federally backed mortgages through the Federal Housing Administration. The FHA appraiser arrived on a Tuesday morning in a brown sedan with federal plates, wearing a gray suit and carrying a clipboard. For exactly 11 minutes he walked the property without going inside the house. Then he drove away, and 3 days later the appraisal came back refused. The reason given on the official form was non-standard construction, high risk, unmarketable. That phrase, unmarketable, appeared in FHA appraiser guidance documents issued quietly that same year. The guidance flagged earth-sheltered and earth-bermed residential construction as ineligible for conventional federal mortgage insurance. The Federal Home Loan Bank Board issued nearly identical guidance the same year. Through the remainder of the 1980s, mortgage appraisers working under federal guidance systematically refused to finance or refinance earth-sheltered homes across the country. Architects who specialized in the method watched their clients struggle to sell properties that could not pass a conventional appraisal. By 1990, earth-sheltered residential construction in the United States had effectively collapsed as a movement, while every independent performance study continued to prove the method worked exactly as designed. The financial infrastructure of the country had been instructed to treat a functioning technology as if it had never existed. The motive behind that instruction was never written down in a single smoking gun document, but you do not need one when the money trail is this obvious. The American residential heating and cooling industry was worth somewhere north of $40 billion a year by 1982. Every furnace that was not installed meant between $700 and $2,000 of lost revenue per household. Every service contract that never got signed meant another $200 a year in maintenance fees never collected by the contractor. The mortgage industry made its money on refinancing cycles. A conventional home in the 1980s was refinanced on average every 9 years. An earth-sheltered home that used 1/5 of the heating fuel and almost no cooling was a home that could be paid off early and stayed paid off. That was revenue erased from the balance sheet of an entire lending sector. And the building code apparatus, which is written almost entirely by committees populated by industry representatives, simply never updated its residential provisions to include earth contact construction as a standard option. Most residential codes today still classify earth-sheltered walls as engineered construction, requiring additional permitting, additional inspection, and additional professional certification, a paperwork wall designed to exhaust the average homeowner before they ever pour the first shovel of dirt onto a membrane. Now, if you already own a house and you are sitting there thinking this only applies to people building new construction, stay with me because this next part is specifically for you. What the Icelanders did for an entire wall assembly, you can do for the single coldest exterior wall of your existing home without ever touching a single interior surface of the house. The work happens entirely outside, and the result is felt inside your living room the first night the wind blows. The whole project fits inside one weekend and roughly $500 in materials. Here is exactly how you do it. Walk around your house on the next cold morning and find the wall that feels coldest to the touch from the inside. In most of the continental United States, that wall is facing north or northwest. That is your target wall. Outside that wall, clear a strip of ground roughly 4 feet wide running the full length of the foundation. Grade the soil so it slopes gently away from the house for drainage. Install a waterproofing membrane against the wall itself, a heavy 6mm polyethylene sheet or a commercial foundation wrap, which runs about $40 to $60 at any building supply for a roll large enough to cover the wall. Seal the top edge of the membrane to the wall with a bead of polyurethane caulk. Now you start building the actual berm. Pile clean filled dirt against the membrane, building it up in 6-inch layers, compacting each layer with a hand tamper as you go. Build the berm up to a height of 2 to 3 feet against the wall, with the outside face sloped at roughly 30 degrees back from the foundation. If you can source filled dirt locally from a construction site or a neighbor grading a property, you can often get it for the cost of trucking alone. If you need to purchase it, budget about $250 for enough volume to cover a 30-foot wall at that height. Once the berm is built and compacted, plant it with ground cover to hold the soil in place and prevent erosion over time. Crown vetch, creeping juniper, or common periwinkle all work perfectly for this. A single flat of starter plants from a garden center runs $40 to $60 and will fill in completely within a single growing season. That is the entire project right there. Membrane against the wall, fill dirt compacted in 6-inch lifts, drainage gravel at the base, and ground cover on the exterior face. Total materials cost for a standard 30-foot bermed wall comes out somewhere between $450 and $550, depending on what you can source locally. Total labor is 1 weekend for a homeowner of average physical condition working with a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and a hand tamper borrowed from a neighbor. The first winter after you complete the work, you will notice something very specific inside your house. The wall that used to feel cold to the touch from the inside will no longer feel cold to the touch anymore. It will feel like the rest of the walls in your house. Your thermostat will kick on noticeably less often, especially during the overnight hours between midnight and 6 in the morning when temperatures bottom out. Your heating bill for that first full winter will come in roughly 20 to 30% lower than the previous year on the same house. A single bermed wall does not deliver the full 43% reduction the University of Minnesota measured on a fully earth-sheltered home, but it delivers a substantial fraction of that number for the cost of a single dinner at a decent restaurant in most cities. And if you want the full effect of what the Icelanders built, there is a second option the turf farmers would recognize immediately, something you can build entirely on your own property without any building department approval in most jurisdictions because it qualifies as an outbuilding. You dig a pit 4 feet deep into a south-facing slope on your property, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet in plan. You frame it with pressure-treated 6x6 timbers, sheathe the roof with 3/4-inch plywood, waterproof the entire exterior with heavy membrane, and bury it under 2 to 3 feet of local soil. The interior stays between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, without any heating or cooling equipment of any kind attached to it. It functions simultaneously as a root cellar for long-term food storage, a storm shelter for tornado country, and an emergency backup shelter during grid-down events. Total materials cost comes in at right around $500 if you source your lumber carefully from a local mill instead of a big box retailer. Same physics as the Icelandic turf house Stefan showed me, and the same end result. 1 weekend of real work, and the rest of your life with a 55-degree room on your property that costs nothing to operate. One more thing worth knowing about the so-called premium version of all this. There are architects operating right now in this country who will design you an earth-sheltered home for somewhere between $15,000 and $40,000 in design fees alone before you ever break ground on the property. Construction cost for a full earth-sheltered home built by a licensed contractor typically runs 30 to 60% higher than conventional construction because the work is classified as non-standard and the labor has to be sourced from specialty firms with specialty insurance. Those contractors are using the exact same physics Stefan's great-grandfather used in the year 1890 with a shovel and a pile of local sod. The only difference between the Icelandic turf farmer and the $40,000 architect is a bill that starts with a comma and runs for 6 figures. Let me tell you about a man I talked to last March in southern Minnesota because he is the one I want you to hear about before you close this video. His name is Harold. He is 68 years old, retired from 31 years of row crop farming, and he lives in a 1971 split-level Rambler he bought new with his wife when they were first married. 2 winters ago, Harold bermed the north and west walls of his house over 2 weekends in October, working with his grandson in a small Kubota tractor he still keeps in the barn out back. His total materials cost came to $486, including the membrane, the fill, and the plantings. Harold kept his utility bills from the winter before the project and the winter after. He showed them to me in his kitchen, laid out on the table next to his coffee cup, with the relevant figures circled in blue ballpoint pen. The winter before he did the work, Harold's heating bill over 5 months came to $2,140. The winter after he finished the berms, with the same thermostat setting and the same family of 4 visiting at Christmas, his heating bill came in at $1,210, a savings of $930 in a single heating season. The berm paid for itself in less than 6 months of operation. Harold told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He said his father farmed that same land for 40 years and always knew to put a windbreak on the north side of a barn because otherwise your cattle froze. And somewhere between his father and him, he said somebody decided we were all too smart for windbreaks. He said it like he was angry with himself for not figuring it out sooner. The knowledge was never lost anywhere. It has been standing on an Icelandic hillside the whole time, inside a turf house older than the United States Constitution. The Mandan, the Mongolians, the Ukrainians, and every other cold climate culture that ever survived a real winter documented the same principle independently. The University of Minnesota proved it with hard data in 1978. Malcolm Wells built his own version in New Jersey in 1975 at 1/5 the heating cost of every other office on his block. And somewhere in a federal office building in 1982, a man with a clipboard decided you would not be allowed to finance it. The waterproofing membrane costs $40 at any hardware store. You are standing on the dirt right now. And 6 feet below your property line, the earth holds steady at 50 degrees all year, waiting for you to press a wall against it. The only thing that was ever missing was somebody willing to tell you it was there in the first place. I want to hear from you in the comments on this one. Drop your state and tell me what you paid for heating last winter. Tell me which wall of your house feels coldest in January, because that is the exact wall where this project will change your bill the fastest. You already understand what is happening here if you believe real practical knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit margin. And if you are tired of watching your heating bill climb every single winter, the link in the description below this video will show you exactly how to save real money on every energy bill in your house starting this season.